Today's mindful moment.
It feels like everywhere you look these days, you hear about how divided we are, right? Like our politics are just so polarized and extreme, and it's all just a recent thing.
Well, that's the narrative anyway, isn't it? This
Yeah.
this idea that everything suddenly went off the rails.
Yeah. But as with so many things, when you actually look back a bit, it's like, maybe not so simple. Maybe not so new.
Exactly. It's tempting to think of political extremism as something that's kind of popped up out of nowhere.
Right. Like it's a totally new problem.
But when you look back at American history, it's like, no, that's not really the case at all.
Not at all. It's more like a recurring theme. It's kind of cycles of fear and division that keep coming back around.
Like a boomerang almost, keeps coming back.
It keeps coming back, exactly. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, this long history of using fear and division for political advantage.
Right, not just looking at today's headlines, but going back and looking at the deeper roots of all this.
And we're going to be drawing a lot of insights from this book, David Corn's American Psychosis, a historical investigation of how the Republican Party went crazy.
A very provocative title, to say the least.
Yeah, it definitely grabs your attention.
Yeah.
But, our aim here is not to focus on any one party.
No.
What we really want to do is look at how both parties, or really just political actors in general, have used these tactics throughout American history.
Yeah, throughout our history. Because it's not just about the Republicans or the Democrats. It's about this pattern of extremism that's kind of woven into our political fabric.
Yeah, exactly. So let's start by going way back. Way back, like to the late 1700s, the early days of the Republic. Corn talks about how the Federalists were using fear of this group called the Illuminati.
Ah, yes, the Illuminati.
The Illuminati. You still hear about them today, right?
Yeah, they're still a popular boogeyman.
But back then they were this shadowy European secret society.
Yeah, this sort of like, Enlightenment era group that a lot of people were quite worried about their influence.
Yeah, and figures like the Reverend Jedediah Morse, he really pushed this fear.
Yeah, he was a big proponent of this idea that the Illuminati were infiltrating America.
Yeah, he was giving these fiery sermons.
Mm-hmm.
He was writing pamphlets claiming that they were behind all sorts of problems in America.
Yeah, trying to undermine our values and our institutions.
Right, and it's not just some random guy on a street corner.
Right.
Like even John Adams, the president.
Right.
He wrote a letter where he was talking about these hostile designs and insidious acts that were threatening America.
Right. So you have these very prominent figures lending credence to these claims.
And that's something you see again and again.
Yes.
This idea that if someone with authority and credibility says something, people are more likely to believe it.
Absolutely. It gives it this air of legitimacy, even if the claims themselves are pretty out there.
Right. It's like if the president's worried about it, maybe I should be worried about it too.
Exactly.
So that's the Illuminati.
Right.
And then you move into the 1820s and you have this whole thing with the anti-Masonic movement.
The anti-Masons. That's a fascinating case.
It is. It's actually like a whole political party that sprung up around this conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
About the disappearance of this guy, William Morgan.
So William Morgan was this guy who was going to expose the secrets of the Freemasons.
Yeah, he was going to write a book spilling all the beans.
Yeah.
And then poof, he disappears.
Vanishes.
Nobody knows what happened to him.
Right. And that just fueled all sorts of speculation.
Yeah. And it created this huge wave of anti-Mason sentiment.
Right. People were convinced that the Freemasons had kidnapped him, murdered him, covered it all up.
Yeah, that they were this powerful, dangerous, secret organization.
Yeah, and the fact that there was this lack of clear answers just made it even easier for people to fill in the blanks with their own fears and suspicions.
Right. It's like anything could be true.
Anything.
And the anti-Masonic Party actually gained quite a bit of traction for a while.
Yeah, they were a legitimate political force for a time.
They did. They elected governors, congressmen. They were a real thing.
Yeah, which shows you how quickly these sorts of conspiracy theories can gain political power.
It really does.
Yeah, when people are afraid and uncertain, they're more likely to gravitate towards these simple explanations, these narratives that tell them who to blame.
Yeah. It's that whole us versus them thing. And the anti-Masonic Party, they eventually faded away, but they kind of set the stage for a lot of what came after.
Yeah, they showed how effective it can be to tap into those deep-seated fears and anxieties.
Right, especially when you have these established figures, these elites, kind of fanning the flames.
Exactly, because it's not just coming from the fringes anymore. It's coming from people in positions of power.
Right.
And that makes it all the more potent.
Right. So then you move into the mid-19th century, and you have the Know Nothing movement.
The Know Nothings.
And they were all about anti-Catholic sentiment, this fear of immigrants, especially Irish Catholics.
Yeah. They were very much driven by this idea that Catholic immigrants were a threat to America.
Yeah. That they owed allegiance to the Pope, that they were going to undermine American values.
Like, that they were inherently subversive, that they couldn't be trusted.
Yeah. And this fear of the other, it just keeps popping up throughout history.
It does. Whether it's the Illuminati, the Freemasons, Catholics, communists, it's this constant fear of some outside group that's coming to destroy our way of life.
Right, right.
And it's so easy to exploit that fear for political gain.
It is. And then, of course, you have the Civil War and Reconstruction. And even though there was this huge push for civil rights, racial prejudice was still a powerful force.
Yeah. Even within the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, there were these deep divisions on race.
Right. And you see that really clearly with Andrew Johnson, who became president after Lincoln was assassinated.
Yeah, Johnson was a staunch white supremacist.
Yeah. He didn't believe in equality for Black people.
Right. He openly opposed efforts to give Black people the right to vote, the right to own land, all the things that they had been fighting for.
Right. And he even said that America was a country for white men.
Yeah, he made that very clear.
Which is just, mind-blowing to think about today. But it shows how even in this moment of supposed progress, the appeal to racial animosity was still so powerful.
It's still a very effective way to mobilize voters, unfortunately.
All right. And then, you fast forward a few decades, late 19th century, and the Republicans are back at it, this time using anti-Catholic sentiment to attack the Democrats.
Right. There was this famous slur that was used against the Democrats.
Yeah.
Rum, Romanism, and rebellion.
Yeah. That one's pretty loaded, right?
Oh, yeah. It basically accused the Democrats of being a party of drunkards, Catholics, and traitors.
Which, whether or not that actually swayed the election, it just shows how willing they were to exploit religious bias for political gain.
Right. It was this very cynical attempt to stir up fear and division among voters.
Yeah. And what Korn points out is that during this period, both parties were kind of peddling their own poison, so to speak.
Yeah, they were both playing this game of exploiting existing divisions and prejudices.
Right. It wasn't just one side or the other. They were both doing it.
They were both guilty of it.
And then World War I comes along, and that brings a whole new wave of fear and paranoia.
Yeah. With the war, there's this intense anti-German hysteria.
Right. Anyone who spoke out against the war, who criticized the government, they were labeled as un-American, as traitors.
Yeah, they were seen as sympathizing with the enemy.
Yeah. And there was even actual violence against people who opposed the war.
Yeah. It was a very dark time for free speech and dissent.
It was. And even the vice president at the time, Thomas Marshall, he basically condoned this violence.
Right. He made this comment that basically suggested that people who oppose the war deserve to be hanged.
Yeah, which is just, chilling.
It is.
But it shows how easily wartime can be used to justify the suppression of dissenting voices.
Yeah. When there's a perceived threat, it's much easier to silence those who question the official narrative.
Right. And then, of course, you have the Red Scare and McCarthyism, which are, probably some of the most well-known examples of this kind of thing.
Yeah. Joseph McCarthy was a master of exploiting fear and paranoia.
He was. He built his whole career on this idea that communists had infiltrated the government.
Right. He made these wild accusations with very little evidence about communists being everywhere. In the State Department, in the Army, in Hollywood.
Yeah, and it was all based on this us versus them narrative.
Yeah, it was this very effective way of creating the sense of an internal enemy.
Right. It was like, there are these evil communists lurking in the shadows, and they're trying to destroy America from within.
Right. And only McCarthy can save us.
Right.
Yeah.
And he really tapped into this fear that was already there.
Yeah. The Cold War was a very scary time for a lot of people.
It was. And McCarthy just amplified that fear to an incredible degree.
And people like Richard Nixon, they saw how successful McCarthy was.
Yeah.
And they started using those same tactics.
Yeah. Nixon was very much a product of that era.
Yeah. He cut his teeth on anti-communism.
He did. And that brings us to the John Birch Society.
Ah, the John Birch Society.
Yeah, they were really out there.
They will.
I mean, their founder, Robert Welch, he believed that communists had infiltrated like every level of American society.
Yeah. He even accused President Eisenhower of being a communist.
Yeah, Eisenhower, the war hero, the popular president.
Right. But to Welch, everyone was suspect.
And what's interesting is how mainstream conservatives reacted to them.
Yeah, like Barry Goldwater, who's a pretty conservative guy himself.
Right.
He initially tried to distance himself from Welch and the Birchers.
Yeah, he knew that they were a bit too much, even for him.
Right. But the Republican Party as a whole, they were a lot more hesitant to completely disavow them.
Yeah, they needed those votes. They needed those volunteers.
Right. And so there was this tension between wanting to appeal to a broad base and also wanting to reject these more extreme elements.
Yeah, and you see that tension really play out at the 1964 Republican Convention.
Oh yeah, that was a turning point.
It was. Nelson Rockefeller, who was, a moderate Republican, he tried to introduce this plank in the party platform condemning extremism.
Right. He wanted to specifically condemn the John Birch Society, the KKK, the Communist Party.
Yeah, all of them.
Right.
And he was met with boos.
Yeah, they booed him off the stage.
And even a weaker amendment that just condemned extremism in general that failed too.
Yeah. It was a pretty clear sign that the far right was gaining a lot of influence within the party.
It really was. So anyway, after Goldwater lost the election in '64, there was this feeling that maybe the Republicans needed to tone it down a bit.
Yeah, there was this sense that maybe they had gone too far.
Right. But then you have Ronald Reagan, who comes along in the 80s, and while he wasn't a Bircher himself, he definitely used rhetoric that resonated with a lot of the same themes.
Yeah. He tapped into this distrust of government, this idea that America was on the wrong track.
Yeah. And he was very good at channeling populist anger.
He was a master communicator.
He was. And he was also very careful not to get too close to the really extreme figures.
Yeah, he knew how to keep them at arm's length.
Right. But he still benefited from their support.
He did.
And his strategist, Lee Atwater, he talked about how they kind of shifted from this overt racism to these more coded appeals.
Right. So instead of talking about keeping black people down, they would talk about, things like forced busing or states' rights.
Right. But the underlying message was still the same.
Yeah. It was still about appealing to white voters' fears and prejudices.
Right. And then, of course, you have the rise of the religious right in the late 20th century.
Yeah, that was a huge shift in American politics.
It was. And leaders like Jerry Falwell, they were very good at mobilizing this base of conservative Christians.
They were. They tapped into this fear of moral decline, this sense that America was losing its way.
Yeah, and they were very much against things like abortion and gay rights.
Right. And they saw Reagan as someone who shared their values.
Yeah. And Reagan was smart enough to cultivate that relationship.
He was.
He didn't necessarily agree with everything they said,
right,
but he knew that he needed their support.
He did.
Mm-hmm.
And he was willing to make certain concessions to them.
Right. And then you have the Nixon presidency, and it's not just about race with him.
No.
It's about, exploiting all sorts of divisions in society.
Yeah. He was very good at pitting Americans against each other.
He was. His vice president, Spiro Agnew, he was constantly attacking the media, the liberals, the intellectuals.
Yeah. He was a real firebrand.
He was. And Nixon himself, he had this whole silent majority strategy.
Right. This idea that there was this large group of Americans who were tired of the protests, tired of the cultural changes, and they were just waiting for someone to speak for them.
Yeah. And Nixon presented himself as that voice.
He did. And he was very successful at it.
He was. And it's interesting to think about, Nixon's own paranoia.
Yeah. He was a very, very suspicious person.
He was. He saw enemies everywhere.
Right.
He was obsessed with leaks and conspiracies.
He was, and that paranoia, it definitely shaped his presidency.
It did. And then, of course, you have the Clinton era, and that's when you start to see the rise of these right-wing conspiracy theories.
Yeah, you have things like Whitewater, Vince Foster, all these scandals that were largely manufactured by the right.
Right. And they were amplified by this growing conservative media ecosystem.
Yeah. You have figures like Rush Limbaugh, Roger Ailes. They were very effective at spreading these conspiracy theories and creating this sense of outrage among their listeners.
Yeah, it was like they were building this alternate reality.
They were.
Where Clinton was this evil mastermind who was, out to destroy America.
Right. And it was a very effective strategy for mobilizing the Republican base.
It was. And then, in the 90s, you have the rise of the militia movement.
Yeah. And a lot of that was driven by this fear of the government.
Right. It was like they saw the government as this tyrannical force that was coming to take their guns and their freedom.
Yeah. And there was this whole thing about black helicopters, this idea that the government was spying on them.
Right. And you have people like Congresswoman Helen Chenoweth, who was, openly sympathetic to these groups.
Yeah. It was this really strange mix of far-right ideology and anti-government paranoia.
And then, as you move into the 2000s, the demonization of political opponents just gets worse and worse.
Newt Gingrich, he really changed the tone of political discourse.
He did. He encouraged Republicans to use this very harsh confrontational language when talking about Democrats.
Yeah, to treat them as enemies, not as opponents.
Right. And Bob Dole, when he ran against Clinton in 96, he was using this whole elites versus the people narrative.
Yeah, which is something that you see a lot of today.
You do. And then, of course, you have the Bush years.
And 9/11 obviously had a huge impact on everything.
It did. And there was this initial period of unity.
Yeah, for a brief time, it seemed like Americans were coming together.
Right. But that didn't last very long.
No, it didn't.
And the Bush administration, they very quickly started exploiting the fear of terrorism for political gain.
Yeah. They used it to justify the invasion of Iraq, the Patriot Act, all sorts of things.
Right. And you also see the rise of Islamophobia during this period.
Yeah, that was a very dark chapter.
It was. And Karl Rove, who's Bush's strategist, he was very good at using wedge issues to mobilize the Republican base.
He was, like gay marriage, for example.
Right. They put anti-gay marriage amendments on the ballot in a bunch of states in 2004, and that really helped turn out conservative voters.
It did. And they also used the swift boat attacks to smear John Kerry.
Yeah. And then, you have people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson who were blaming 9/11 on, feminists and gays.
Yeah, which is just, beyond the pale.
It is.
But it shows how quickly people can resort to blaming the other in times of crisis.
Right. And then you have the Obama era, and that's when you really see the birther conspiracy take off.
Yeah, that was a whole other level of crazy.
It was. And Donald Trump was one of the main people pushing it.
He was.
This idea that Obama wasn't really born in America, that he wasn't a legitimate president.
Right. And it was so blatantly racist.
It was.
But it really resonated with a segment of the population.
It did. And then you have Sarah Palin, who was comparing Obama's policies to communism.
Right. Which is just, absurd.
It is. But again, it worked for a certain audience.
It did. And then you have the Tea Party movement,
yeah,
which was all about, anger and resentment and fear of the government.
Yeah. And there were definitely some racist undertones there as well.
There were.
And people like Glenn Beck and Rush Limbaugh, they were really fanning the flames of that movement.
They were. And it really helped to push the Republican Party further to the right.
It did. And then, finally you get to the Trump era.
And that's when all of this stuff that we've been talking about, it just kind of explodes.
It does. It's like everything that came before was just leading up to this.
Yeah, it was like the culmination of decades of extremism and paranoia.
Yeah. Trump, he embraced the birtherism. He exploited racial resentment. He amplified QAnon conspiracy theories.
Yeah. And he attacked the media. He attacked the democratic process.
Yeah. He was constantly undermining people's faith in institutions.
Yeah, he was.
And it all culminated in the January 6th riot.
Which was just, a horrifying display of what happens when you legitimize this kind of extremism.
It was.
And what's really scary is that even after January 6th, a lot of Republicans still believe Trump's lies about the election.
Yeah. The big lie. is still very much alive.
It is. And so are QAnon and all these other conspiracy theories.
Yeah, it's like they've created this alternate reality that's completely detached from facts and evidence.
They have, and it's a very dangerous situation.
It is. So looking back at all of this, it's clear that this pattern of using fear, prejudice, and conspiracy theories for political gain, it's not new.
No, it's not. It's a recurring theme throughout American history.
It is. And it's something that we need to be very aware of because it's still happening today.
Absolutely. We need to be vigilant.
We do. And I think the big question is, like, what can we do about it?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. How do we break this cycle?
Right. How do we stop this from happening again and again?
I think part of it is just being aware of it. Recognizing these patterns when they start to emerge.
Right, and calling it out, not letting people get away with it.
Yeah, and also being willing to have those tough conversations with people who might be buying into these narratives.
Right, because a lot of times it's people we know, it's people we care about.
Yeah,
and it's hard to have those conversations, but we need to have them.
We do.
Because the alternative is just letting this stuff fester and grow.
Yeah, and that's not a good path.
It's not. So yeah, I think awareness is key.
Absolutely.
And education, learning about this history.
Right. Because if we don't understand how we got here, we're more likely to repeat the mistakes of the past.
Exactly. So if you're interested in learning more about this, I highly recommend checking out David Corn's book, American Psychosis.
Yeah, it's a really insightful look at this whole phenomenon.
It is, and we'll put a link to it in the show notes.
Right.
And as always, we want to hear from you. So if you have any thoughts on this, any questions, anything you want to share, please leave us a comment.
Yeah, we always appreciate hearing from our listeners.
We do. And please, share this episode with your friends, with your family, with anyone who you think might be interested in this topic.
Yeah, let's get this conversation going.
Let's do it.
Because the more we talk about this, the more we understand it, the better equipped we'll be to fight back against it.
Exactly. So until next time, keep thinking critically, keep questioning everything, and most importantly, stay informed.